There was once a question widely discussed online. What is the deepest misunderstanding you've ever had? Among thousands of different answers, one response stood out and received overwhelming agreement, believing that freedom meant being able to do whatever you want, until realizing that true freedom only comes when a person has enough self-discipline. At first, this sounds contradictory. Freedom is usually associated with comfort, flexibility, and the absence of rules. Discipline, on the other hand, is often seen as rigid, restrictive, even something that robs life of joy. But if you observe human life long enough and close enough, an undeniable truth emerges. The more people give in, the more control they lose. The more they follow momentary emotions, the more chaotic their lives become. Without discipline, we're not as free as we think. Our actions are often driven by the inertia of old habits, fleeting motivation, or worse, the expectations and opinions of others. We believe we're living according to our own will, but in reality, we're merely reacting passively to circumstances, emotions, and invisible pressures around us. Over time, people lose the ability to live in alignment with what they truly want, even though they remain constantly busy and in motion. That is why, when you observe people with an exceptionally high level of self-discipline, you will notice a clear pattern. Their lives are more stable, more intentional, and far more grounded. Not because they face fewer problems than others, but because they refuse to be pulled apart by internal chaos. For them, discipline is no longer a form of punishment or self-denial. When taken deep enough, discipline becomes a unique mental state, a profound sense of calm that comes from knowing with clarity that each day you are moving forward, slowly perhaps, but deliberately and under control. And from this very paradox, an important question arises. What if the thing we are missing in life is not freedom itself, but the discipline required to reach real freedom? If that is true, then perhaps it is time to reconsider how we understand discipline, sacrifice, and the true cost of living a life we genuinely have control over. When people take an honest look at their own lives, many begin to notice an uncomfortable truth. Most of our daily choices are not driven by clear intention, but by inertia. We wake up out of habit, work on autopilot, seek entertainment based on emotion, and procrastinate out of familiar exhaustion. Everything flows so smoothly that we mistake it for a life we consciously chose, when in reality we're merely drifting toward whatever feels easiest in the moment. Without discipline, people are easily led by their emotions. On days when motivation is high, they push themselves a little. On days when they feel tired, they give themselves permission to let go. Decisions are not made based on long-term goals, but on short-term mental states. Over time, life becomes a series of passive reactions. Act when it feels good, quit when it feels boring, avoid what feels hard, delay when it feels exhausting. And in that state, people lose control without even realizing it. More dangerously, without discipline, we begin to live according to other people's perspectives. What we like, what we dislike, what we should do, what we should pursue, these are shaped by our environment, social media, casual advice, and standards we have never truly questioned. We think we're choosing, but in reality, we're merely copying. We believe we're walking our own path, yet we're simply following a road the majority has already laid out. As a result, despite being busy and constantly putting in effort, many people feel empty and directionless. They don't truly know what they want, nor are they confident that what they are doing is taking them anywhere meaningful. Life becomes a sequence of days filled with activity but lacking direction. And without direction, even effort becomes exhausting. By contrast, people with a high level of discipline rarely live in this state. They do not allow momentary emotions to dictate long-term behavior. They know what needs to be done, what can be ignored, and what must be postponed, no matter how tempting it may be. This self-regulation gives them a very different feeling, a sense of ownership over their lives. Not because their lives are always comfortable, but because they know exactly where they are going and why they are willing to accept present discomfort. At a deep enough level, discipline is no longer a constant internal battle. It becomes a stable operating system. People no longer wake up each day asking, "Should I try today or not?" Because that decision has already been made. And within what seems like rigidity, a paradox emerges. People feel lighter, calmer, and freer than ever before. When it comes to discipline, many people tend to see it as a secondary trait, nice to have, but not strictly necessary. There is a common belief that being a little smarter, a little luckier, or finding a burst of motivation at the right moment will eventually make everything work out. Reality, however, points in the opposite direction. Most persistent problems in life do not come from a lack of ability, but from a lack of sustained discipline. When someone lacks discipline in daily routines, their health will inevitably decline. Without discipline and time management, work constantly falls behind and pressure keeps piling up. Without emotional discipline, relationships are more likely to spiral into conflict and instability. And without discipline in thinking, people easily rationalize their own poor decisions. From this perspective, discipline is not something that is merely nice to have. It is the invisible foundation that determines the quality of almost every area of life. Psychologists have pointed out that the process of building discipline typically unfolds in three very distinct stages. The first stage is enthusiasm, when people are filled with determination, feel ready to change, and believe results will come quickly. This phase is relatively comfortable because fresh energy masks the real difficulties ahead. Then comes the second stage, pain. The novelty wears off, results are slow to appear, and the effort begins to feel increasingly heavy. At this point, discipline is no longer fueled by positive emotion, but demands pure consistency. Most people quit at this stage, not because they are incapable, but because the pain lasts long enough for them to attach negative labels to discipline itself: suffering, restriction, self-punishment. Few realize that they are stopping right at the threshold of the third stage, enjoyment. This is when discipline no longer requires constant willpower because it has transformed into habit, into rhythm. What once felt uncomfortable becomes familiar and even begins to provide a sense of security and stability. When discipline is taken deep enough, it no longer is about forcing yourself to fight against who you are. Instead, it becomes a sustainable source of energy, one that frees people from chaotic, emotion-driven living and from being controlled by laziness or momentary desire. Rather than spending mental energy each day making decisions about basic behaviors, people can now focus their full capacity on what truly matters, and from there, life begins to run more smoothly, more clearly, and with far less exhaustion. If you look more deeply into the journey of discipline, you will see that it is rarely a straight upward line. Discipline operates as a psychological process with a clear pattern, and that pattern is remarkably consistent across people. It almost always begins with enthusiasm, moves through pain, and only then reaches enjoyment. The real issue is not whether you step onto this path, but where you choose to stop. The first stage, enthusiasm, is when everything seems easy. You set new goals, create new plans, and imagine a better version of yourself. At this point, energy comes from emotion, determination, hope, and the belief that this time will be different. Because of that, people tend to underestimate the challenges ahead. They assume that as long as they can maintain their current mindset, progress will take care of itself. But enthusiasm does not last. When it fades, the second stage appears, the stage of pain. This is where the true nature of discipline reveals itself. You still have to do the same things consistently and repeatedly, but without the emotional boost. Results are not yet clear enough to be motivating, while fatigue and boredom continue to grow. The most common feeling at this stage is not failure, but doubt. Doubt in yourself, doubt in the path you are on, and doubt about whether all this effort is actually worth it. This is where most people quit, not because they lack ability, but because prolonged discomfort leads them to draw the wrong conclusion about discipline itself. They begin to believe that discipline equals suffering, that a disciplined life is a joyless life. In reality, they have only made it halfway. They do not realize that if they endure a little longer, an entirely different state is waiting on the other side. The third stage is enjoyment, but not the loud, exhilarating kind. It is a quiet sense of relief and stability that comes when discipline becomes a natural part of life. At this point, people no longer need to rely heavily on willpower to do the right things. Behaviors that once felt difficult now happen almost automatically. And in this state, discipline is no longer experienced as sacrifice, but as a solid foundation that allows life to run smoothly. What is unfortunate is that very few people ever reach this stage, not because it is too far away, but because they turn back before pain has a chance to transform. Discipline has never betrayed people. It is people who tend to abandon it too early, right before the real rewards begin to appear. If there is one deep reason why so few people can sustain discipline over the long term, it is the fear of loss. At its core, discipline always requires giving something up in the present in exchange for a greater value in the future, and this runs directly against human psychology. We are not wired to think far ahead, we're wired to protect what we already have. Psychological research has consistently shown that people are far more sensitive to losses than to gains. Losing money, an opportunity, or a familiar comfort causes significantly more psychological pain than the pleasure of gaining something of equal value. That is why, when faced with the choice between holding on to immediate gratification and pursuing a long-term goal that still feels abstract, the brain almost always leans toward the safer option: lose nothing, or at least lose nothing right now. This is why discipline often feels like an unbearable sacrifice. To build a healthy body, you have to say no to fast food, greasy meals, and mindless cravings. To study or work effectively, you have to give up late nights of movies, gaming, and endless scrolling on social media. To build a solid career, you must trade away weekends of rest and social gatherings that offer little long-term value. Every one of these no's triggers a sense of loss, no matter how great the future benefit may be. The problem is that people feel very clearly what they are giving up, but only faintly what they stand to gain. The rewards of discipline arrive slowly, accumulate quietly, and rarely produce strong emotions in the present. In contrast, the pleasures of indulgence are obvious, immediate, and easy to access. This imbalance leads many people to compromise with themselves again and again until a lack of discipline becomes their default way of living. Over time, people fall into familiar contradictions that they recognize as irrational, yet still lack the courage to change. They overeat while dreaming of an attractive body. They stay up late chasing entertainment while hoping for high performance at school or work. They indulge in the present while wishing for early financial freedom. These opposing desires coexist not because people are ignorant, but because fear of loss consistently wins in everyday decisions. Only at a certain point, when the cost of indulgence becomes high enough, do people begin to realize something crucial. True strength does not belong to those who try to keep everything, but to those who are willing to subtract from their lives, to clearly decide what is unnecessary, what must be let go, and what is worth holding on to even at a high cost. And when that shift in thinking occurs, discipline finally has a chance to emerge as a conscious choice rather than a reluctant form of self-coercion. The reality is that most people understand very clearly the cost of living a disciplined life. It is not a lack of information, nor a failure to see the path ahead. The issue is simple. They know the price, but they don't want to pay it. Because those costs are not abstract, they are concrete, immediate, and directly threaten everyday comfort. To have a healthy body, no one can avoid controlling their diet and maintaining regular movement. That means saying no to convenient fast food, emotional eating, and cravings driven by stress and fatigue. Everyone knows this, but in the moment of choice, the feeling of losing present enjoyment is far more vivid than health benefits that still feel distant, and so compromise happens again. To study effectively or perform at a high level at work, the price is often deep focus and time spent alone. You have to pass on meaningless conversations, mindless scrolling, and extended entertainment sessions that exist only to kill time. For many people, however, not participating creates a sense of missing out, of being disconnected from the collective flow. That fear can outweigh the desire to improve. To build a solid career, especially in the early years, the cost is often delayed gratification, late nights of extra work, weekends spent learning, and time invested in personal skill development instead of full rest. Everyone understands that this is a period for accumulation, yet very few are willing to live at a disadvantage compared to others while results are still invisible. The truth is, there is no path that allows you to keep everything and still achieve exceptional outcomes. Life always operates on the principle of trade-offs, whether we acknowledge it or not. The real question is not whether a trade-off exists, but whether we are making it consciously or paying the price unconsciously. Many people choose to postpone paying the cost because it feels easier in the short term, but a delayed cost does not disappear, it quietly accumulates. Eventually, they realize they have paid a far greater price: declining health, falling behind in skills, missed opportunities, and most importantly, a loss of trust in themselves. And at that point, discipline no longer feels like a difficult choice. It becomes something they wish they had started much earlier. Because people are unwilling to pay those costs, they gradually fall into familiar contradictions, patterns repeated so often they begin to feel normal. They overeat, yet wish for a healthy, fit body. They stay up late, dependent on their phones and instant entertainment, yet hope to stay focused and productive. They spend emotionally while dreaming of future financial freedom. These desires are not rare, they are widespread, but they coexist with behaviors that directly undermine them. What is worth noting is that most people are fully aware of these contradictions. They are not naive nor uninformed. They know their actions are not leading them where they want to go. But instead of confronting that truth and changing, they soothe themselves with familiar phrases. "I'll deal with it later. Now isn't the right time. I'm still young." These statements may sound harmless, but repeated long enough, they become a form of collective self-sedation, allowing people to maintain the status quo without facing the discomfort of change. In this state, many lives are stretched between two opposing forces, the desire to move forward and the urge to cling to comfort. People constantly feel deprived of money, time, and motivation, yet are unwilling to let go of the very habits that quietly drain all three every day. The exhaustion does not come from doing too much, it comes from living in prolonged conflict with oneself. At some point, usually after enough setbacks, people begin to realize that strength is not about wanting everything. Real strength lies in the ability to choose. It means having the courage to face one's limits, to acknowledge that resources are finite, and therefore not everything deserves to be kept. A strong person knows how to subtract from their life, cutting away habits, relationships, and desires that no longer serve their long-term direction. Redefining strength also means accepting an uncomfortable truth. To preserve what truly matters, we must let go of what matters less, no matter how familiar or pleasurable it feels. This is not self-cruelty, it is clarity. And only when this clarity emerges does discipline stop feeling like a burden and start becoming a rational tool, one that allows people to live in alignment with what they genuinely value. Many people still believe that discipline is simply about better time management, waking up earlier, working harder, or forcing themselves to follow a strict schedule. But if discipline exists only at that surface level, it is fragile. All it takes is fatigue, stress, or a small disruption for the entire system to collapse. This does not happen because people are weak, but because the root of the problem was never addressed. At its core, discipline is a matter of mindset. When one's perspective on life, goals, and the price that must be paid has not changed, every attempt at discipline becomes temporary self-coercion. People continue to act based on old emotions, old instincts, and unexamined beliefs. They try to live with discipline, yet deep down still believe that discipline is stealing their joy. With that mental foundation, quitting is only a matter of time. Only when mindset shifts can discipline spread into every area of life. When a person truly understands that every choice carries a cost, that saying no to short-term desires is actually a way of saying yes to a long-term future, behavior begins to change naturally. Discipline no longer needs constant reminders because it has become part of one's personal value system, shaping how time, energy, emotions, and attention are used. At an even deeper level, discipline is a long-term battle against what is most natural in human nature: laziness, the desire for comfort, the craving for immediate pleasure, and the instinct to avoid difficulty. It is hard not because it is complex, but because it runs directly against instinct. And for that very reason, discipline has never been a path for the majority. It belongs only to those willing to reshape how they view life, those prepared to accept deliberate discomfort today in exchange for real stability and genuine freedom in the future. When people are young, many believe that life is short and therefore meant to be enjoyed. Have fun while you can, stay comfortable while it's possible, and worry about the future later. This belief is not entirely wrong, but it represents only half of the truth. The other half, rarely discussed, is that every act of indulgence in the present leaves a cost to be paid in the future. And that cost is almost always far greater than the initial comfort it provides. In the early stages, those costs rarely show up. The body still feels strong, the mind can still tolerate late nights, and performance has not yet noticeably declined. This absence of immediate consequences convinces many people that they are the exception, that warnings apply to others, not to them. But time spares no one. Small choices, repeated day after day, quietly accumulate, and at some point they all come due at once. Uncontrolled eating and lack of movement do not cause immediate damage, but over time they erode health, stripping the body of its natural resilience. Chronic late nights, dependence on phones, and short-term entertainment do not destroy the mind overnight, but they steadily weaken focus, leaving the mind constantly tired and unfocused. A life without direction, one lived day to day, may feel light and easy at first, but in the long run it leads to disorientation and a gradual loss of faith in one's own future. The most dangerous part of youthful illusion is not enjoyment itself, but the confusion between controlled enjoyment and unconditional indulgence. When that line is blurred, people easily trade their future for immediate comfort without realizing it. And when the cost finally becomes undeniable, they understand that what once felt like freedom was in reality a loan, one with interest that grows higher over time. When undisciplined choices are repeated long enough, they stop being isolated actions and begin to form a chain of consequences, closely linked and nearly unavoidable. Each act of indulgence today becomes the cause of a consequence tomorrow, and as those consequences pile up, life starts to drift noticeably off course. Uncontrolled eating and a lack of movement drain vitality. The body feels heavier, endurance declines, and illness appears earlier than expected. As physical health weakens, mental clarity becomes harder to maintain. People grow more irritable, more easily exhausted, and less patient. From there, the ability to maintain discipline in other areas also deteriorates, creating a vicious cycle that is difficult to break. Chronic late nights and dependence on phones, social media, and short-term stimulation quietly erode the ability to focus. At first, it feels like scattered thinking or difficulty concentrating for long periods. Over time, however, productivity drops noticeably, thinking becomes shallow, and mental responses slow down. People begin doing more but achieving less, spending long hours working, yet feeling as though they are barely moving forward. As health and focus decline together, long-term goals gradually fade from view. A life without direction, one lived day to day, may help reduce pressure in the short term, but in the long run, it leaves a deep internal void. Feelings of confusion, meaninglessness, and self-doubt begin to surface. At that point, the problem is no longer a lack of opportunity, but the loss of inner capacity to seize opportunities when they appear. This chain of consequences is especially dangerous because it does not happen suddenly. There is no clear moment that signals everything has gone wrong. It unfolds slowly, slow enough for people to adapt to it, and fast enough that by the time they realize what has happened, they have already paid a heavy price. And that is when many come to understand that the most frightening cost of lacking discipline is not failure itself, but the gradual loss of control over one's own life. It is within this context that discipline needs to be re-examined in an entirely different role. Discipline is not something that steals joy from life, nor is it a tool for self-punishment or for turning life into a series of harsh days. On the contrary, discipline exists to protect people from the consequences that indulgence inevitably brings. Without discipline, it is easy to become a slave to desire and momentary emotion. We eat when we are stressed, scroll when we feel empty, procrastinate when we are afraid, and chase short-term pleasure to fill voids we are unwilling to confront. Discipline does not exist to eliminate these needs, but to place them in the right position, at the right time, and within limits we can control. From another perspective, discipline is the mechanism that allows people to take ownership of their lives. It enables us to decide in advance how we will act, rather than allowing circumstances and emotions to decide for us. Through discipline, we no longer have to wrestle daily with basic choices, because the most important decisions have already been made. This clarity creates a sense of inner stability and security, something many people mistakenly believe can only be achieved by letting everything go. More importantly, discipline provides the foundation for building a better version of oneself over time, not through dramatic leaps, but through small, consistent, and controlled progress. Each disciplined action is a quiet commitment to oneself that one is moving in the right direction, even if the path is slow and far from glamorous. When understood correctly, discipline no longer stands in opposition to freedom. It is the condition that makes freedom possible. Freedom does not come from doing whatever one wants, but from having the clarity not to be pulled by things that will demand a heavy price in the future. And only when discipline is placed in this proper role can people gradually build a life that is stable, intentional, and truly their own. In the end, when you look back at this entire journey, one thing becomes clear. Discipline has never been merely a personal preference. It is a fundamental law by which life operates. You can postpone it, ignore it, or try to work around it, but you cannot escape the cost that a lack of discipline inevitably leaves behind. If you want freedom, discipline is not an optional add-on. It is a path you must pass through. Every person is paying a price every single day. You either pay the price of discipline through deliberate discomfort in the present, or you pay the price of indulgence through silent but persistent consequences in the future. The difference between these two paths is not about ease or difficulty, it is about who is in control. When you consciously choose discipline, you hold the steering wheel. When you avoid it, life makes the decisions for you. Ultimately, discipline is not meant to turn people into cold, mechanical beings. It exists to help them live in alignment with what they truly value. It allows you to stand firm against short-term temptation, maintain clarity in a noisy and chaotic world, and build a future that does not rely on luck. It is not the easiest road, but it is the most reliable one if you want to take ownership of your life. And if you are currently feeling exhausted, directionless, or aware that you know many things, yet are not living the life you want, then what you may need is not more motivation, but an internal upgrade. That is precisely why Think and Speak English exists, not only to improve your English, but to help sharpen your thinking, clarify how you are living, and reveal how you can live better. Upgrade your mind. Improve your English. Start today with the smallest disciplined action you can take. And if you are ready, continue the journey with Think and Speak English in the episodes ahead, where thinking is sharpened daily and change moves beyond theory to become part of real life.